Imagine your body is falling apart. Your skin detaches from your muscles as if it were wet paper. Your internal organs bleed endlessly. And worst of all, you are conscious. You feel every second of this cellular destruction. Now imagine that, in the middle of this absolute agony, you beg to die. You scream to the doctors with the little voice you have left. I am not a guinea pig. Stop! But they do not stop. They keep turning on machines, injecting drugs, and forcing your heart to beat, even when your DNA has already been completely annihilated. For 83 days. 83 days of torture that defies the limits of medical ethics and human compassion. This is not a science fiction story. This is the real case of Hisashi Ouchi, the nuclear technician who received the highest dose of radiation a human being has ever withstood and was kept alive against his will so science could study his slow death. What you are going to see today will make you question medicine, family, and how far the right to live or die goes. If you have a weak stomach, I warn you, leave now. The mental images we are going to create are disturbing. But if you have the courage to look into the radioactive abyss, subscribe to the channel now. Turn on the bell, because we are going to enter the emergency room of the University of Tokyo Hospital. Welcome to day 1 of the rest of Hisashi Ouchi's death. It all started on a seemingly normal morning of September 30th, 1999, in the small village of Tokaimura, Japan. The JCO nuclear fuel processing plant looked like just another industrial workplace, but inside, negligence and lack of training were about to set the stage for the worst nucleaxia in Japanese history before Fukushima. Hisashi Ouchi, a 35-year-old technician, was working with his colleagues, Masato Shinahara and Yutaka Yokokawa. They were not elite nuclear scientists. They were workers following orders. Orders that violated every safety rule known to nuclear physics. The task was simple: purify uranium oxide to make fuel for a reactor. But the procedure they were using was a crude improvisation, a dangerous shortcut to save time and money. Instead of using automated and safe machines, which mixed uranium in small controlled quantities, they were doing it manually. Yes, manually. Imagine men pouring enriched uranium into stainless steel buckets as if they were making soup in an industrial kitchen. Ouchi was leaning over the precipitation tank, holding a funnel, while Shinahara poured the mixture of uranium and nitric acid. They did not know, or were not warned, that there was a critical mass limit. If you put too much uranium in a small space, the chain reaction starts spontaneously. The safe limit was 2.4 kilograms. In that tank, they had put 16 kilograms. They created an open atomic bomb inside a closed room. At 10:35 in the morning, physics collected its price. Ouchi saw a blue flash shine above the tank. That light, beautiful and terrifying, was Cherenkov radiation. It is the visual signal that the air is being ionized by neutrons traveling faster than light. There was no fire explosion. There was no bomb noise. Just that silent blue flash and the sound of radiation alarms screaming in panic. But the damage was already done. In that thousandth of a second, trillions of neutrons passed through Hisashi Ouchi's body like microscopic bullets. He was closest to the tank. Leaning over the source, he received an estimated dose of 17 sieverts of radiation. To give you an idea of what that means, 8 sieverts is considered 100% lethal. Ouchi received double the instant fatal dose. What happened in the following minutes is what makes radiation so scary. Ouchi did not drop dead. He did not melt right there on the factory floor. He felt dyssynosis and vomited, which is common in food poisoning or heat stroke. He walked out of the room. He was taken to the decontamination room and then to the local hospital in an ambulance. He was conscious, talking to the paramedics. He looked at his own hands, and they looked normal. Maybe a little red, as if he had gotten too much sun at the beach. That is the cruelty of radiation. It is a silent killer that kills you from the inside, before showing any signs on the outside. While Ouchi was there, perhaps worried about losing a day of work, his body was already a walking corpse. Upon arriving at the National Institute of Radiological Sciences in Chiba, doctors began to understand the gravity of the situation. But it was only when he was transferred to the University of Tokyo Hospital that the true extent of the horror was revealed. Ouchi seemed fine. He talked, laughed nervously, apologized for the trouble. But when doctors collected a sample of his bone marrow to analyze his cells under the microscope, they saw something they would never forget. Normally, human chromosomes, which carry our DNA, look like organized pairs of excess. It is the map of life. In Ouchi's microscope, the chromosomes no longer existed. They had been shattered. They looked like broken glass scattered on a table. I want you to understand the gravity of this. DNA is your body's instruction manual. It tells your cells how to divide, how to heal, how to function. Without DNA, cells do not know what to do. They cannot regenerate. Ouchi's body had lost the ability to create new cells. The cells he had would die naturally in the coming days, and there would be no new cells to replace them. He was literally starting to die at a cellular level. His skin, his intestine, his blood, his immune system. Everything had a short expiration date, and the clock had started ticking backwards. The doctors, led by Dr. Kazuhiko Mikawa, knew the chance of survival was zero. Statistically, biologically, physically, zero. But they were facing a unique case in the history of medicine. Never had a human being received so much radiation and arrived at the hospital alive. The external pressure was immense. Japan was in shock. Ouchi's family, his wife and young son, were desperate, begging for a miracle. And the doctors, driven by a mixture of Hippocratic duty and morbid scientific curiosity, decided to fight. They decided they would use every technology available in modern medicine to keep that man alive, whatever the cost. On that first day, Ouchi was placed in a sterile room, isolated from the world. He still thought he would go home soon. He told the nurse, "I hope to get well soon." He did not know that that room would be his prison, his torture chamber, and eventually, his morgue. He did not know that the redness on his skin was the prelude to something terrible. The skin, the largest organ of the human body, is constantly renewed. But Ouchi's cells could not renew themselves. The biological tape that keeps our skin stuck to our body had been dissolved. Soon, the skin would start to come off. The world looked at Tokaimura with fear, but inside that hospital, fear was turning into an experiment of horror. Ouchi was transformed from patient to project. The medical team prepared for a battle they knew they would lose, but they wanted to see how long they could delay defeat. They were not saving a life. They were prolonging a death, and the price of this prolongation would be paid in pain. A pain that not even the most potent morphine could erase. If you are finding this heavy, take a deep breath, because what happens from the 7th day on will make the first day look like a walk in the park. Ouchi's immune system disappeared. His white blood cells, the body's defense soldiers, dropped to zero. He became vulnerable to any bacteria, any fungus, any dust in the air. He was a man without a shield in a world full of arrows. And then, his sister volunteered for something unprecedented. A peripheral stem cell transplant. It was the first hope, the first attempt to rebuild the destroyed defense system. But radiation does not just destroy what it touches. It poisons the soil where life tries to grow. Ouchi's body was no longer a functional human body. It was a collapsing biological reactor. In the next chapter, we will see the beginning of visible physical degradation. We will see the moment medicine became torture, and the moment Ouchi, for the first time, asked to be let go. Follow the descent into radiological hell. Subscribe. Leave your like if you support our investigative work. And get ready. The suffering is just beginning. The first week in the hospital was marked by a false calm, a silence before the biological storm. Hisashi Ouchi's sister, in an act of desperate love, donated her own peripheral stem cells. The medical team's hope was that these healthy cells would find their way to Ouchi's destroyed bone marrow and begin producing new white blood cells, rebuilding his immune system from scratch. And for a brief moment, it seemed science had won. Tests showed the sister cells were taking hold. There was celebration in the sterile corridors. But radiation is a treacherous enemy. It was not just in Ouchi's body. It was Ouchi's body. His internal environment had become so toxic that it began attacking the very new cells trying to save him. It was like throwing fresh seeds into soil made of sulfuric acid. Around the 10th day, the visual horror began. The biological tape I mentioned earlier, the one that holds the epidermis to the dermis, disappeared completely. When nurses went to remove the medical tape holding catheters and sensors on Ouchi's chest, his skin came off with the tape. It was not a small wound. The skin came off in large sheets, leaving raw, red, wet flesh exposed to the cold hospital air conditioning. Imagine the pain of a third-degree burn, but instead of being in a specific spot, it starts spreading all over the body. Ouchi had no protection left. He was being flayed alive by his own biology, without anyone touching him. To try to contain the massive loss of fluids through the exposed flesh, doctors wrapped him in gauze and ointments, turning him into a modern mummy. But every dressing change was a session of medieval torture. "Ouchi!" screamed. He was conscious, lucid, and feeling every nerve. Being exposed, the pain was so intense, it surpassed the capacity of painkillers. Fentanyl, morphine. Nothing seemed to silence the agony of having his body dissolving. He began losing liters and liters of body fluids through open pores. It was as if he was sweating blood and plasma 24 hours a day. Dehydration was constant, requiring doctors to pump saline and blood into him at the same speed it leaked out. It was on the 11th day that Ouchi's psychological barrier broke. Until that moment, he'd been a model patient, polite and stoic, typical of Japanese culture. But pain and despair ripped off his social mask. In a moment of terrifying clarity, while doctors tried to insert yet another needle into his shredded body, he screamed the phrase that would haunt the medical team forever. "I can't take it anymore. I am not a guinea pig." That was not a lament. It was an accusation. Ouchi realized, before anyone else, that he was not being cured. He was being used. He knew the end was inevitable and wanted the right to die in peace. But medical protocol and family pressure kept him trapped in that infernal bed. That phrase caused a moral earthquake in Dr. Mikawa's team. Some nurses questioned if what they were doing was ethical, but the decision was made. They could not stop. To relieve Ouchi's suffering and perhaps their own, so they would not hear the screams anymore, doctors decided to sedate him heavily. They put him in an induced coma. They introduced a tube into his trachea and connected him to a mechanical ventilator. From that moment on, Hisashi Ouchi lost his voice. He would never speak to his wife or his son again. He became a silent passenger in his own decaying body. Unable to stop, unable to say it hurts. The silence in the room was broken only by the rhythmic beep of monitors and the hiss of the breathing machine. But the external silence hid the internal collapse. Radiation attacks not only the skin, it attacks all rapidly dividing cells. And where do we have rapidly dividing cells? In the lining of our intestine. Ouchi's intestinal mucosa, responsible for absorbing nutrients and stopping bacteria from feces entering the blood, began to die and detach. He started having uncontrollable diarrhea, but it was not feces, it was blood. He was defecating his own intestinal lining. The amount of blood he lost daily was astronomical. On some days, he needed 10, 12, 15 blood transfusions just to maintain circulating volume. Blood went in through a vein and came out through the intestine in a matter of hours. He became a man of glass, fragile and transparent. Doctors were fighting a war on multiple fronts. The skin was falling off. The intestine was bleeding. The lungs were filling with fluid pulmonary edema. Because the heart, bombarded by drugs to keep blood pressure high, was starting to fail. And then came the cruelest discovery of all. Upon analyzing the sister's cells that had been transplanted, scientists saw something impossible. The new cells, which were healthy and had not been exposed to the accident's radiation, were also suffering mutations. Ouchi's body was so radioactive, so full of activated neutrons, still present in his tissues, that he was killing the rescue cells. It was the bystander effect in its most macabre form. Radiation was contagious at a cellular level. There was no salvation. His body was a hostile environment for life. At 27 days, the intestine began to melt for real. Permeability was total. Bacteria that naturally live in the gut and help with digestion now invaded the bloodstream freely. Ouchi went into total sepsis. His blood was poisoned. Fever. Spike. His body swelled like a balloon due to fluid retention and kidney failure. He was unrecognizable. If you looked at the bed at that moment, you would not see a human being. You would see a red mass covered in tubes, dialysis machines, ventilators, and infusion pumps. Technology kept him alive. But what is life in these conditions? The family, visiting daily, saw that horror through glass, or dressed in full protective suits. They saw the chest rise and fall mechanically, and thought that while there is life, there is hope. Doctors did not have the courage to say in plain words, "This is over." They kept treating each symptom in isolation. Did the kidney stop? Dialysis? Machine. Did the lung fail? Increase oxygen? Did pressure drop? More vasopressor drugs. They were fixing parts of a car that had already fallen off the cliff and was on fire. And so, we reached the 50th day. Ouchi was alive only by technical definition. His brain was sedated. His body was in ruins. But the heart, the human heart, is a stubborn organ. It kept beating, forced by drugs. But even stubbornness has a limit. Aoki's heart was tired. It was about to send the final signal of surrender. In the next chapter, we will see the event that defines the true brutality of this case. We will see the day Ouchi's heart stopped. Not once, not twice, but 3 times in 1 hour. And we will see the doctor's controversial decision to bring him back, resurrecting him for more pain, violating the peace of death repeatedly. Prepare to question the very humanity of modern medicine. The torture is about to enter its final and most agonizing phase. On the 59th day of hospitalization, Hisashi Ouchi's body decided it was time to leave. It was not a mental giving up, as his mind had already been lost in a fog of sedatives and toxins for weeks. It was a biological giving up. The heart, that tireless muscle that had been pumping poisoned blood for almost 2 months, simply stopped. The cardiac monitor, which kept a monotonous and artificial rhythm, let out the continuous, high-pitched sound every doctor fears. Asystole, flatline. Clinically, Hisashi Ouchi was dead. The suffering was over. Nature had finally granted him the mercy of eternal rest. But in that hospital room, mercy was not allowed. The moment the alarm went off, the medical team went into combat mode. Instead of looking at the clock and declaring death, as would be the humane thing to do in such an irreversible case, they initiated the cardiopulmonary resuscitation protocol. Doctors took turns compressing Ouchi's fragile chest. Ribs, weakened by radiation, cracked under the pressure of the massages. They injected epinephrine, atropine, potent drugs to kick the heart back into activity. And, cruelly, it worked. The heart started beating again. Ouchi was brought back from the abyss. But the universe seemed to want to correct the doctor's mistake. 20 minutes later, the heart stopped again. The second cardiac arrest. The body was screaming enough. And again, the medical team attacked. More massage, more drugs, more shock. They forced that exhausted heart to beat by force. It came back, and then, minutes later, the third stop. 3 times in less than an hour. Hisashi Ouchi died 3 times that morning, and 3 times he was ripped from the peace of death and dragged back to the hell of his hospital bed. Why did they do this? That is the question that echoes in the head of anyone who studies this case. The official justification was that the family had not signed the "Do Not Resuscitate" order. The wife and son, paralyzed by shock and irrational hope fueled by medicine, could not say stop. And the doctors, bound by protocol and perhaps blinded by the scientific opportunity to keep that body functioning, continued. But let us be honest. That was not treatment. That was corpse maintenance. By resurrecting Ouchi 3 times, they caused irreparable damage to the brain and other organs, which were without oxygen during the stops. If there was any remnant of consciousness or self inside that shell, it was erased that day. What remained was just a biological machine for feeling pain. From that day on, degradation accelerated to a level that defies description. The body, now with a damaged brain and unstable heart, began to rot visibly. Muscles began to necrotize. The flesh, without adequate circulation and without cell renewal, turned black. And when I say black, it is not a figure of speech. Ouchi's legs and arms began to mummify. But the doctors did not give up. They brought in burn specialists, graft specialists. They tried to cover the exposed areas with artificial skin, lab-grown skin, and even donor skin. But nothing stuck. The body rejected everything, or there was simply no base for the skin to stick to. It was like trying to stick a sticker on a wall made of water. The daily routine became a cycle of horror. Constant blood transfusions, 24-hour dialysis, ventilator pushing air into soaked lungs. Ouchi received so many vasopressor drugs to maintain blood pressure that the extremities of his body, fingers and toes, lost circulation completely and died. He was slowly The medical team, exhausted and perhaps regretful, continued the work of Sisyphus, pushing the stone up the hill, only to watch it roll back down every day. They say some nurses needed therapy years later. They cleaned fluids, changed blood-soaked gauze, and listened to the sound of machines keeping alive a man who should have died on day one. The smell in the room was unbearable, a mixture of strong hospital disinfectant and decaying human tissue. No ventilation could remove the odor of death emanating from a living body. The family visited less. What they saw in the bed was no longer the loving husband and father. It was a scientific experiment gone wrong. A mass of tubes and suffering flesh. The image of Hisashi Ouchi in that final stage is something that, if shown on broadcast TV, would cause trauma. It is visual proof that medical technology, without ethics, can create monsters. On the 80th day, almost 3 months after the accident, Ouchi's body was unrecognizable. He had lost almost all original body fluids, replaced by medical solutions and donated blood. His eyes, which one day saw the blue flash, were dried out and perhaps blind, although they remained open, staring at the white hospital ceiling. He did not respond to stimuli. He did not move. He just existed as a vessel for radiation and human obstinacy. The question was no longer will he survive, but rather when will they have the decency to turn off the machines? The answer would come 3 days later. But do not think it was an easy decision. Until the last second, there was hesitation. Until the last beat, there was the attempt to prolong the inevitable. The case of Hisashi Ouchi forces us to look in the mirror and ask, how far does our right to interfere with death go? Is saving life, at any cost, always the right thing to do? Or is it that, sometimes, letting die is the greatest act of love we can offer? In the next and final chapter, we will see the final moment. Day 83. The day the torture finally ended, and the dark legacy this case left for humanity. We will see how death, when it finally arrived, was not a tragedy, but a liberation. And we will make the final analysis. What have we learned from the man who was forced to live in hell for 83 days? Subscribe now, because the conclusion of this story will change the way you see medicine forever. The calendar marked December 21st, 1999. 83 days had passed since the blue flash in Tokaimura. 83 days since Hisashi Ouchi's DNA was pulverized. Outside the hospital, the world prepared for Christmas and the turn of the millennium, worried about the millennium bug. But inside the intensive care unit, time seemed to have stopped in a perpetual nightmare. The body in the bed had no defenses left, no intact skin left, and its organs worked only because expensive machines said they must work. But that morning, biology gave its final ultimatum. Ouchi's blood pressure began to drop dizzily. The vasopressor drugs, which 4 weeks forced his blood vessels to contract to keep blood circulating, stopped working. There was no muscle tone left in the arteries. The body was collapsing structurally. The medical team, led by Dr. Mikawa, gathered the family. Ouchi's wife and son were called. Unlike that chaotic day of the 3 cardiac arrests, this time the atmosphere was of solemn resignation. Doctors explained that if the heart stopped again, any attempt at resuscitation would not only fail, but would be an act of useless violence. The family, exhausted by almost 3 months of anticipated mourning, finally agreed. The do not resuscitate order was finally signed. At 11:21 that night, Hisashi Ouchi's heart beat for the last time. The monitor drew the final flatline, and the continuous sound of the alarm filled the room. But this time, no one ran. No one jumped on his chest to break ribs. No one injected adrenaline. The doctors just turned off the alarm. The ventilation machines were silenced. The rhythmic and mechanical noise that served as a soundtrack to Ouchi's hell ceased. There was a heavy, almost sacred silence. Hisashi Ouchi, the man who defied death for 83 days, was finally free. The pain, which accompanied him like a faithful shadow, could no longer touch him. But if you think the horror ended with death, you are wrong. The most shocking part for science came later. The autopsy. When pathologists opened Ouchi's body to understand what 17 sieverts of radiation actually do to a human being over time, they found a scene of destruction that defied anatomy. Ouchi's muscles, were no longer muscles. They were not red and fibrous. They had turned into a gelatinous and shiny substance, almost liquid. Radiation had broken down muscle proteins to such an extent that the flesh simply fell apart. The heart, that warrior that fought to the end, was atrophied and full of fluids. The intestine, which was the first to fail, was smooth and thin like tissue paper, without the villi necessary to absorb nutrients. It was a dead tube, but the scariest thing was the bone marrow. Upon cutting the bones, doctors expected to find some sign of regeneration, perhaps a remnant of the sister cells. They found the void. The marrow was white, fatty, and deserted. There was no life there. The transplanted cells had been completely annihilated by the residual radiation of Ouchi's body. His body had become a biological reactor so hostile that it killed even the cure they tried to inject. The case of Hisashi Ouchi entered the history books not as a triumph of medicine, but as a somber warning. It raised ethical questions that are debated to this day in medical schools. Was his treatment an act of medical heroism, or was it torture disguised as science? Dr. Makawa, years later, admitted the frustration and sadness of seeing his patient deteriorate day after day, unable to save him. He wrote books, gave lectures, trying to justify that everything was done in hope of a miracle. But for those who see the photos, which we will not show here out of respect and YouTube guidelines, but which you can imagine, from the description, the answer seems clear. Technology gave us the power to extend life, but it did not give us the wisdom to know when death is the best option. The Japanese government, embarrassed by the accident and the negligence of the JCO company, drastically changed nuclear safety laws. The company lost its license, executives were arrested, and millions in compensation were paid. But none of that brought Ouchi back. None of that erased the image of that skinless body from the memory of his wife and son. They received the money, but paid with their sanity. Ouchi's legacy is written in pain and radiation. He taught us exactly how much the human body can take, and the answer is, it takes much more than it should, if forced. We live in an era where nuclear energy is still necessary, where medicine advances to make us immortal. But Ouchi's story is a brutal reminder that we are fragile. We are clusters of cells held together by a delicate genetic code, a blue flash, a miscalculation, and all of that falls apart. Ouchi was not a voluntary hero. He was a victim of a system that prioritized efficiency over safety, and then was a victim of medicine that prioritized the duration of life over the quality of death. As we end this documentary, I want you to reflect. If it were you in that bed, if it were your skin falling off and your organs melting, what would you wish for? That doctors fought for 83 days in the name of science, or that they had the courage to hold your hand and let you go on the first day? The answer seems obvious now, but when hope and fear mix, humanity tends to make terrible mistakes. Hisashi Ouchi now rests, but the question he screamed on that 11th day still echoes in the corridors of history. I am not a guinea pig. May his voice, silenced by radiation and sedatives, serve as an eternal lesson. Never again. Never again. If this video opened your eyes to the dark side of medicine and nuclear energy, your subscription is mandatory. We do not bring fairy tales here. We bring the naked, raw, and often radioactive reality. Click the subscribe button to join our community of strong minds. Share this video so Ouchi's story is not just a dusty medical file, but a living warning. Thank you for watching until the end. See you at the next autopsy of a disaster.